If you were following our reading through the daily Bible, then this past week has been an eventful one. In some translations, Genesis chapter 37 verse 2 says, this is the story of Jacob. I don't think that that's a good translation, and a lot of other translations would disagree with that. I think there's good reason for that. Because right after this statement, let me go ahead and give you the New International Version says, this is the story of Jacob's family line. Because right after that statement, they begin to tell the story of Joseph. And it takes up really the remainder of the book of Genesis. What is that? Some 13 chapters that involves the story of Joseph. It's an incredible journey of ups and downs. Now, there were several things that I had thought about as far as lessons for this week. I had thought about a lesson on the patriarchs, of talking about the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. And still may touch on that in the week ahead. I also thought about this one. It's really kind of a side story, but it deals with one of Joseph's brothers. I want to just give this to you. Take notes, write it down, and maybe it's something you want to do on your own personal time. But look at the story of Reuben. If you use a concordance, you'll find his name recorded 13 times in the book of Genesis. And as you go through those 13 times, you're going to begin to get a decent picture, I think, of his character, his reputation, his dependability. There is going to be a really important story that comes into play when they're taking Benjamin to see Joseph. Remember, they don't know it's Joseph at this point, but they're getting ready to take Benjamin, or at least that's what the sons are wanting to do, and Jacob's not wanting any part of it. Reuben steps forward and says, Father, I will take care of him and you can count on me. And Jacob's just like, no. I mean, he just doesn't even consider Reuben's words. Not long after that, Judah steps forward and Jacob ends up sending Benjamin with Judah. There's a reason that he doesn't send him with Reuben. If we read through those, you'll find out why. It's an interesting story. There's some really good lessons to learn from that. So I hope that you'll consider that as you go through and look at this week's reading. Because we're going to be closing out the book of Genesis here and moving on to the book of Exodus. Joseph, though. He's our topic for tonight. That's the text that I got that said, hey, we are going to talk about Joseph Sunday night, aren't we? And I said, we sure are. It's a great story because I consider Joseph to be one of the true heroes in the book of Genesis, really in the whole Old Testament. When we look at him and we look at this example of faith and perseverance, if we look through, there's some time markers that will give us some good indication of his age. I think this is helpful. But I'm assuming at this point, since we've read this together, you're going to know a lot of the comments that I can just make. All right, so Joseph was sold into slavery about the age of 17. Genesis chapter 37, verse 2 tells us that he was 17 years old. That's the time that the brothers get angry with him because Joseph is having the dreams, and they end up throwing him in the well and then selling him to a group of people, and he goes off as a slave. Genesis chapter 41, verse 46 tells us that Joseph was 30 years old when he went into the service of Pharaoh. Then we know that there were 7 years of plenty. There were 2 years of famine when the brothers came, and Joseph's talking about them coming. He said, because you've got 5 more years of famine, and if you don't come, then you're not going to make it. Tell you that to tell you this. Joseph's story starts at 17 years old. He gets sold as a slave 39 before he is reunited with his family. So that's quite a journey, isn't it? From 17 to 39. And a lot of ups and downs as we read the story of Joseph. All right. Genesis chapter 37, verse 19. Joseph has been having these dreams. And all of those dreams point to the fact that his family will be bowing down to him. Brothers didn't like that. They language is pretty strong. They hated Joseph. And there was a point where they said, here comes that dreamer. And that's when they see this opportunity to get him and to throw him in the well, end up selling him as a slave. They thought about killing him. They decided not to do that. So instead, they sold him as a slave. If you'll remember, all of this, it started because, well, Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, and everybody knew that. Jacob gave Joseph this coat of many colors. But then Joseph began to have these dreams, and these dreams were pointing to the fact that his family was going to bow down and worship him. And so he's just telling everybody what these dreams are. The brothers didn't like him, we know that. But even Scripture says that his father rebuked him for that. Because Joseph had the dreams, and he ends up, his father's rebuking him. Now, but later in the story, as he ends up in Pharaoh's service, remember, Pharaoh has dreams. He can't interpret them, but Joseph did. Man, Pharaoh welcomed Joseph. Man, tell me about these dreams. Tell me what they mean. I want to know. Talk to me. Just find that interesting. His brothers, back in Genesis 37, they are filled with anger. Boy, their just hatred for him continued to grow. And as he's coming, I could just see him. He's got that coat on, and they're looking at him come over the hill toward him, and they're just like, well, there's that dreamer. And boy, they've just finally had enough. They're like, well, we got him out here, and Daddy's not here. And that's when they decided on the action that they took. But by the time we fast forward to the point where we're going to get to our main story tonight, Joseph becomes the second most powerful man in Egypt. And remember, that's at like age 30. It's an incredible story. Joseph is sold as a slave, and he goes off. He ends up in Potiphar's house, but he's sold as a slave, and I would imagine that there's some pretty hard manual labor involved with that. So you think about the fact that his hands are going to be worn. He's going to be tired because of the work that he's having to do. But by the time we get to the good part of the story, what do we know? Well, we know that he's going to be wearing a signet ring. And what is that? Signet ring is a sign of royalty in this particular case. And you talk about just a story of ups and downs, and to see where Joseph was at his lowest point, to see where he ends up as second in command. And it's really just a great story to follow. There's a point that he would have been bound by shackles, by chains, but then by the time he's serving Pharaoh, what only chain that he's wearing is a chain of gold. Again, great contrast of the before and after stories. And then I think about that coat. Boy, that coat was a source of a lot of heartache among the family. The brothers covered it in blood, and they took it back to the father as a sign that they could sell their story to their father, that, Joseph is no longer with us. By the time we get to the point where he's serving with Pharaoh, he's wearing a royal wardrobe. A lot of ups and downs. It was a lot of ups and downs. Joseph's life had been that series. He had gone from being favorite son to being a slave. He had gone from being a slave to in Potiphar's house, where he became this person of great importance. But then Potiphar's wife got involved with it. She made accusations against him that had Joseph thrown in prison. When he's there, there's the cupbearer and the baker. The cupbearer ends up getting released. He forgets about Joseph. Joseph interpreted some of their dreams. He forgets about Joseph. Joseph's left there. He's alone. He's been forgotten. But then ultimately, a couple of years later, from that particular point, he goes from prisoner to national hero. Again, I've taken a lot of that story and put it right there. But here's the thing. If you've been reading along with us this past week, everything I've talked about is review, because you've already read that. That's going to allow us to get to this point that I really think it's an important part for us to get to. This is the story. This is the real turning point for Joseph. Pharaoh had dreams, and he couldn't interpret them. And he brought in a group of people. He said, hey, y'all tell me what these mean. Help me to understand the interpretation of these dreams. And nobody could do that. And it was then that the cupbearer was reminded of Joseph. Joseph is cleaned up and he's brought into Pharaoh's presence. And then they begin to talk about the dreams, and Joseph gives the interpretation. Let's open our Bibles to Genesis chapter 41. It's where I consider a real turning point in the story for Joseph. So that's where we want to focus tonight. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they'd done so. They looked just as ugly as before. And then I woke up. In my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magician, but none of them could explain it to me." 2 dreams. The fact that it was 2 is significant. Had the same pattern. The 7 bad devoured the 7 good, whether it was the 7 bad cows devouring the 7 good or the 7 bad heads of grain devouring the 7 good heads. So that's when Joseph said, basically, expect 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Genesis 41, verse 29, 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph is speaking now. But 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. So a famine is coming. By the way, famine, it is not a word that Egyptians wanted to hear. Here's what a famine could mean. After 1 month of a famine, the Egyptian economy could be hurt. A year of famine, and all of a sudden Pharaoh is beginning to feel that as far as his influence, his power, and his authority in the land. But if you get to 7 years of famine, that's devastating to the land. 7 years of famine would be devastating to the land. The mighty Nile River would look like a creek at that point. Crops would be dwindled to a field of twigs. This would be devastating, and it would impact not only the entire country, but areas surrounding them as well. Joseph defined the problem. Then he proposed a plan to deal with it. Genesis chapter 41, verse 33 is our scripture reading for tonight. "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." So there were good times and bad times were coming. So from a leadership standpoint, and this is a great plan. Joseph has identified the problem. He's identified a potential solution. But then there comes this big question. Who will lead it? Who will be the one that would lead in that time of need? And the whole point is that what you're doing is you're saving up for the rainy day. Principle still applies to us today. You get a paycheck and you put some aside. Why? Because you're going to need it for a rainy day. It may be tires go bad, maybe the battery goes dead, maybe you have a repair in your house. It's something like that. but you want to prepare for that rainy day. This time, they know, well, it's not going to be a rainy day. Actually, it's going to be the opposite. It's going to be a non-rainy day. And so Joseph knew, but you've got to store up and you have to prepare for this. We know it's coming. It was 2 dreams. The matter has been firmly established by the Lord. This is going to happen. So then the question becomes, who is going to do this? Can we find such a man, anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? That was the key question that answered. Now, he answered his own question, Pharaoh did, in the next verse. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all of this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are subject to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Quite a journey, isn't it? Quite a journey when you think about just not very long ago, Joseph was in prison. He felt like he had been forgotten because he had. But now an opportunity has availed itself and Joseph becomes a national hero. He becomes this one who leads the nation through a mighty crisis where a lot of countries would have come to their peril at that point. But not Egypt, because Egypt had a leader with a vision to help prepare for that problem that was coming. There are some practical lessons, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that, practical lessons that we can learn by having studied the story of Joseph this week. And so let's get to those if we can. The first lesson that I noticed is this, is that prolonged challenges don't have to discourage us. Prolonged challenges don't have to discourage us. Genesis chapter 1 verse 46 says that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 13 years of ups and downs. When do you get to a point of 13 years of ups and downs that you get to the point that, man, this is just going to be as good as it gets? Become content, become satisfied in prison. At one point, he has the memory of being his father's favorite son. At one point, he has the memory of being in charge in Potiphar's household. But then he thinks about the times that he's been wronged, whether it was from his brothers, whether it was the false accusations of Potiphar's wife. Maybe it was being forgotten by the cupbearer. You see, those things can really take a toll on you. But we don't have to let these challenges discourage us. They don't have to define us. Joseph didn't do that. When his opportunity came, he was prepared and he seized the moment. A second lesson to learn is that bad memories don't have to defeat us. You think about these memories that Joseph might have. Boy, it's been 13 years since he's seen his father. It's been 13 years since his brother shoved him in that well, in that cistern. And he can't forget the look, the picture of that well. Maybe the picture of what it was like to be put in chains and be led away from his family. And he sees his brothers are laughing at him as he's being taken away by a group of people he doesn't even know. He might have the memory of the voice of Ms. Potiphar, the one who was continually making advances toward him. But then there was the hatred-filled voice when she made the false accusation against him. You see, there are certain things that can just stay in our mind, whether it's a picture of a cistern, whether it's the voice of someone and the lies that are oozing out of their mouth, that are false accusations against you. And look where it landed him. Landed him in prison. Oh yeah, there's another memory. The smell. The smell of the prison. every day the same smell. And in some senses, you could look at that, it was the smell of death. Because it was the smell of hopelessness. But Joseph did not let those bad memories, whether it was a picture, whether it was a sound, or whether it was a smell, he didn't let it defeat him. Important lesson for us. Man, I think about this. We don't have to let prolonged challenges discourage us. We don't have to let bad memories defeat us. And then we want to be careful that we don't let great blessings derail us. For all of the problems that Joseph had faced, now he's at a point. He is the second most powerful man in Egypt. He has been placed, Pharaoh has placed Joseph over the entire nation of Egypt. Pharaoh said, remember we've just read the verse, that only in respect to the throne will I be greater than you. But I'm putting all of this under your care and under your charge. You are the leader for such a time as this. How would Joseph handle the good times? How would he handle it when his brothers came in? They didn't recognize him. He immediately recognized them. He'd have an opportunity for revenge. What would he do? We know how that story ended, though. But he had that opportunity. He could have done things like that. He could have let the power go to his head. You know, we've seen enough examples in real life, in our day, of where people let success go to their head. And they lose sight of their faith. They lose sight in that everything that we have is ultimately a provision from God. And instead it's, look what I have done. Look what I have achieved. Look what I have amassed. Great blessings don't have to derail us. You see, one of the great things about Joseph's story is it's a story of faith. Oswald Chambers says, I like this. I think this part about how we handle the blessings of life, I think that's important. We talk about how we're going to handle the bad times, but we also need to talk about how we'll handle good times. Oswald Chambers says, not every man can carry a full cup. The most exacting test of all to survive is prosperity. In other words, how will you handle it when things go well? I find that very interesting. Like I said, one of the great things about this is Joseph is this great example of faith and of perseverance. One of the things to notice as we go through the story of Joseph, particularly when we get to this interaction with Pharaoh, is his continued reference to God. At least 4 times in that conversation, Joseph brings up the name of the Lord. Let me see if I've got these right. Genesis chapter 41, verse 16. He says, God will give Pharaoh the answer. Chapter 41, verse 25. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Chapter 41, verse 28. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. And then chapter 41, verse 32. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. Johnny, why the emphasis on that? Because Joseph used his promotion. And at a time when he's up here, spotlight's on him, and he puts God on center stage. He's got an opportunity to speak good, to speak a good word for the Lord. And that's exactly what he did. So friends, I think about this story of Joseph. Wow, the lessons we can learn is how do we handle it? How do we handle it when we're hurt? How do we handle it when those that are closest to us hurt us? How do we handle it when somebody makes a false accusation against us? How do we handle it when the person that we thought was our friend forgets about us? And how do we handle it when we have a measure of success? Awards, accolades, things are going well. How do we handle it then? In each of those moments, good times and bad, Joseph kept his faith in the Lord. Does that mean that every day was easy? I don't think that Scripture goes that far to tell us that. I think that there were days that whether it was the sights of thinking back about that well, or the sound of Potiphar's wife's voice, or whether it was the smell of the prison, well, that's some tough stuff to deal with. But Joseph didn't let it get the best of him. His faith remained strong. And when he had opportunity, when he had time, he took that opportunity. He seized the moment and he spoke a great word for God. And God blessed his leadership. He blessed his efforts. And through this, God's promise remained consistent. It remained in place because all of Joseph's family was brought together. And this would be the place that ultimately, hundreds of years later, they would end up leaving that and they would make their way to their new home, the Promised Land. It's a great story. Hope you continue reading your Bibles daily so that we can continue to have these great discussions. I appreciate those of you that are reaching out with your questions, with your comments. I love that. I'm encouraged by that, and I certainly hope you are as well.